And that way, okay, I just sent you the Zoom link. It's in the chat, and that way I'll send you the recording as soon as we're done.
All right, I'll see you over there.
Okay.
Yay.
Yay.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Okay,
There she is.
there we are. I love it. Okay, amazing. Okay, so we are yes, we are recording. Yay! Okay, well, I'm so now you got me nervous.
No, you did. I was like, as I was getting ready for it, I was like, ooh, I'm nervous.
Well, I'm so excited. Thank you for being my first Q&A guest for the Un Poco de Relajo newsletter. I have just I think you've changed my life and the work you've done with your podcast. I think you've changed a lot of people's lives. So you are definitely a person of interest, not just, I think, to Salvies, to podcasters, but I think the folks who take a huge amount of time to look through intrinsically through these details in history are made out of something special. So I have a few questions, if you'll allow.
I would love to. I really appreciate you saying that. I like when I saw that your book was coming out and that like our work was coming out at like similar times, I was like, man, it is serendipity. It is like kismet. And it also shows that the children of the diaspora are really like, we're all craving that same thing of this connection of a recapturing of telling our own stories. I'm such a huge admirer of your book, and thank you for asking me to do this. Yeah.
Yeah, oh my goodness. I was listening to your podcast and there were certain phrases that you would say that I know I've said before along this journey of like, there were just things like hearing your conversations with your parents, the travel back to El Salvador to do some more research, like the being alone and transcribing, translating all these interviews and then trying to weave. And I'm sure the weight of like, this is something I felt, how can I like do this justice when there is such an enormous story here? And I see my vantage point and I see why I need to do this. But I guess let's start there. Like, what were some of the things what helped you start and what helped you finish? Because for me in the cookbook, those were two different sets of reasons.
Uh, yeah, I mean, definitely went through a lot of imposter syndrome going through the process because there were definitely moments where I was like, who am I to be telling this story? Like, what gives me the right to like be the one to do this? And I had always known that I wanted to do something with my parents' story and to tell their story in some kind of way because I think my family has such an extraordinary story, but also such a common story, that our story is really like the story of Latin America and of a lot of families that sort of leave their homelands for various reasons and try to, go for the American dream. And I think my parents are just such extraordinary people. So I knew I wanted to do something with that. And the Oscar Romero story found me so late in life, and felt like there's so many parts of it and the story of El Salvador in general that feels like it's speaking to right now. And it's not that far in the past, like it's such recent history and it feels like nobody talks about it and it's forgotten. And it's so similar to like the way that the civil rights movement in the United States is now like a symbol, but like the reality of what was happening at that time is lost. It's just like on MLK Day, everyone's like, happy MLK Day. Like it's peace, he wanted peace. And it's like, no, he was a revolutionary. He was like radical, like people did not like him. And I feel like there's so much of that you can see in the Oscar Romero story also. So like it was a confluence of just like the timing, the opportunity, being able to tell this on Sacred Scandal, and them being open to, because Sacred Scandal is a show that normally does stories of like controversies in the church, right? Like the first season is about I think a nun who is murdered by someone in her parish, like one of the students in the school. The second season is like about a cult, basically. And so this was a huge departure from what the show normally is, but they really took a chance on letting me follow this story. And then by the end of it, it was just like sheer power of will trying to get through it. Because yeah, going through hours and hours, I mean, hundreds of hours of tapes of interviews that I did with people and trying to piece together the puzzle of like, what is the best way to tell this story? What is a way to tell this story that is respectful and truthful? It was, there were many, many tears shed. There were many late nights. There were many days where I was like, I literally don't know if I can do this. And feeling the weight of, if I don't tell my tia Margarita's story, no one's ever going to know this story. I think I say this in the podcast, but like her name was never published in a newspaper. The only people who remember her are the people in our family. And her story deserves to be told. People should know about this. That's like what kept me going towards the end. And after it was published, just like getting all of these notes from people where they were like, thank you. And this helped me understand my family. And I had a conversation with my dad that I had never been able to have before. Like it's made it all worth it. But it was a hard process.
There's something that I shared recently on the newsletter about kind of the emotional journeys that as Salvadorans we go through when we're trying to learn our broader history. We get these what I called intellectual cultural vergazos. Like anytime you're like, let me learn, and then you get hit with the headline that just like punches you over the face, and you often find El Salvador reduced down to a headline that represents trauma, violence, not a place that you see in your loved ones, like a joy of resilience. How was it for you to kind of, you went through many, I'm sure, intellectual, cultural vergazos, accounts that are written by people who are not Salvadoran, and you see them lacking a nuance. Like, tell me how you took care of yourself. Did you even know? Because for me, I didn't. I made every rookie mistake. Um, so yeah, what was that like?
100% made a billion mistakes. Everyone was like, how are you getting through this? Are you going to therapy? Like, are you going to the spa? Like, what are you doing, girl? And I was just like, no, my poor husband is holding me together right now.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah. And like, one of the first steps of the process is going through and reading all the research materials and all of the accounts that were written about this time period. And just to find like Joan Didion, this very celebrated, very well-respected author, and having her words, terror is a given of the place, be the like leading narrative about El Salvador during that time is just so infuriating and such a slap in the face. And like, she might be a wonderful author and a wonderful, wonderful journalist. That does not mean that she knows this place, and that does not give her the right to be the voice of this place in this time period. And so that's definitely a part of what motivated me to want to do this, is like, we don't have our own versions of this story. And when I look at someone like my tia Vilma, who has been through like the hardest life you can imagine, and who still gets up every day and is thankful to God for giving her another day in life, and who, has the most infectious laughter, and who still finds joy. And to see the joy in my family when we all get together on Thanksgiving and make panes, like there's just so much to celebrate in our culture, and our people are so resilient. And just to have all of that reduced down to violence and MS-13 and the idea that like, the people that immigrate here are animals. Like, it's just so insane to me that like that was that was all there was. And a part of that is because all you had were parachute journalists who were going in for 2 weeks looking, the fixers know where to take you when that's the story that you're looking for. And that's the
Yeah.
story that you're going to get. And I think it's the story is much more complicated than that. And that's what I was trying to do in my podcast, is to show that, like, this is the result of generational trauma, of American imperialism, of conflicts that were brought to El Salvador, and that, we had no business being a proxy battle for the Cold War, but because the US and other powers wanted to meddle and wanted to control a region, and had financial stakes in the matter, like, people suffered. And I think it's Ignacio Martin Baró in episode 8 of the podcast. He's one of the Jesuits that was murdered, and his words, the militarization of the mind, right? Like that's what was happening during the Civil War, that it was a whole population that was being traumatized with constant violence, and that directly leads to the formation of MS-13 and the years of violence that followed the war. Like, that's not a narrative that gets discussed anywhere. It's just, oh, well, there must be just violent criminals. It must be in their nature. Terror must be a given of the place. Like, it's not a given. It was given to the place, but it is not born of this place. And so I think, like, being Salvadoran, having these personal ties to my family and to this place, like, it's so important for us to be able to tell our stories and to give this nuance to the story, because no one else is going to understand it unless they spend the time there. And the truth is, most journalists just don't do that.
When I remember exactly where I was driving and I heard you talk about that quote of how el pueblo salvadoreño is just stuck in this way of thinking, and because of this police state that we all survive. I was leaving my parents' home late at night, and I had just been needing to decompress from something that we were going through as a family, because it is the case. And I was like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. And it reminds me of another time where uh if you've been to LA, you know you grew up here. And there's the outdoor Salvadoran market. And the outdoor Salvadoran market is across the street from a police station. And my friend Vlad, who is Salvadoran, said, wow, doesn't get more Salvi than that. And, we laugh to keep from crying at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so true in our language, in how we interact, in our expectations, in all of the how we survive. It's a very policed and militarized way. And you don't realize that until you have this counterpoint to kind of validate that experience. I actually bought the collection of his writings after listening to your podcast, because I'm like, yo quiero saber más, necesito. This is like a prescription that I am giving to myself because it's so important. How I feel like there's probably been so many moments that maybe changed you, and you can walk away from it saying, okay, I'm different now. This is not the same Jasmine. But is there a moment that to you stands out from doing this research, from spending time with your family in their restaurant, or listening to these interviews, going to these places where you walked away feeling, I can't go back to that person anymore because I am different now. I carry this information with me now.
I think after the interviews with my tia Vilma and learning the real backstory of what happened to my tia Margarita. So spoilers for anybody who hasn't listened to the show, but my tia Margarita was taken by the death squads. I never got to meet her. She was like, she's part of my family's origin story because she drove my mom to the airport in San Salvador when my mom was coming to the US, and she drove back to San Miguel, and like 2 nights later was kidnapped, and then days later my grandma found her, or they found Margarita's body, and she had been taken by the death squads. And, you know, I talk about this in the show, but the assumption at the time was always like, oh, if the death squads took you, they must have had a reason to take you. You must have been a subversive. You must have been in the FMLN. You must have been at a meeting. Somebody must have seen you. And that was just the assumption that I had growing up. Like, I had never really asked details about it. I knew that my tia had been murdered, but I didn't know the truth behind it. And just the pettiness of the actual reason why that happened to her. It was just neighbors. It was just somebody didn't like you. It was just, you know, it was so easy to just pick up the phone and be like, oh, I saw so-and-so. It was very much like The Crucible. You know what I mean? I saw Goody Proctor with the devil. Like, it was so, and this is a thing that Terry Carl, who I speak to about the Jesuits and is an expert on El Salvador at the time, said also. She was like, I was shocked at the time, and this is a thing that happens in conflicts constantly, right? I was shocked at how often the reason someone died was, I wanted their land, I wanted their donkey, I wanted their whatever, I wanted their wife. You know what I mean? It's like these very human stories that come out of huge geopolitical conflicts, right? It's this downstream effect of Reagan signs a piece of paper with his pen, millions of dollars get sent to this place, you know, weapons are bought, a soldier is trained, a phone call is made, and somebody's family is changed forever. Margarita's murder changed my family forever. And her children and their children and their children have all been affected by this butterfly effect moment. And to learn the pettiness of the reason, and also to see the effects of it generationally, it really just blew my mind of like how far reaching these things can be, and why it's so important for us to be politically active. It's a thing that you see in the Oscar Romero story also, right? Like, Oscar Romero did not want to be a political actor. He was not interested in politics. He was like, that's not for me. I'm a priest. That's not my business. And once you're faced with the actual realities of what it means to be a person in the world, there is no separating yourself from politics. It affects all of us all the time. And so, yeah, I don't think I'll ever be the same after that. I was already kind of like politically minded before that. And doing all of this research on these stories has fundamentally changed the way that I operate in the world.
I was so shocked to learn some of that about Monsignor Romero. I was like, wait, he wasn't always down? Like, that was surprising to me. And it was also like hearing you say, like, it is to your benefit that you be politically involved in some way. Because it is shocking to me how sometimes, like, family will, or just people in the Salvadoran community will say, oh no, that's too much trouble. Those are not the conversations, when the whole reason we are here was politically motivated because of what we had to endure as a people, you know. So it can be a little funny, I think, to see those opinions come from the generation before us, when they get so surprised. Oh, Carla, why are you going to a march? Or why are you being so vocal? Or XYZ. It's like, well, there's a consequence, and the butterfly effect is very, very true.
Well, and to a certain extent, like, you understand it, right? They've come from this, there's this ingrained fear of getting involved and being too loud and saying something, because the repression for generations is so horrific. Like, when I first started doing the research for the podcast, I was like, oh, I have to start the podcast in 1932 with La Matanza, because that's really the first time that this conflict starts. And then I was like, girl, if you start in 1932, there's going to be a 50 episode podcast. You can't do that. You only have so much time.
I know.
But like La Matanza, right? This moment in 1932 when the government, you know, it's political, it's racial, it's ethnic cleansing. It goes, you know, like this idea that like no hay negros en El Salvador, like all of these things, they go all the way back there. They're all interconnected. right? It's about the struggle for labor rights. It's the oligarchy, like all of these things are interconnected. They all go all the way back to this point. And the the repression is very purposeful to keep people from speaking out, to tell their children, don't say anything, keep your head down. But you know what? It comes for you anyway.
Yeah.
And so you either fight or you live in poverty and allow this generational poverty to continue, these cycles to continue.
So much of this, of course, like it's like you're in my journal unpacking these things. And also how great to know like we are not alone. And I think these conversations really help to solidify, like, say the thing out loud, because 9 times out of 10, there's already somebody who's like thinking they're the weird one for having these thoughts. And I recently launched the SalviSoul book club because I have felt so alone in that journey to learn. And when the only other people are telling you, don't learn about that, don't like burden yourself with this information, because there's these types of griefs, right? The grief of not knowing and then the grief of knowing, which has its own kind of weight. And Coffee Land, I don't know if you've read it, but we are reading this book, and it is such a surreal experience to to learn about a man who became the king of coffee. And you're talking about like 1932, the book goes as far back as 1880 in El Salvador. And to hear about how he set up coffee to be this huge economic engine. And then to know the stories I know of my great grandmother who picked coffee. And to hear how this man built an empire for himself and built up empire on the backs of women like my Mama Juana. And to read these accounts of his life and to read a sentence that I was so mad. I put the book down. I was like, hasta aquí llegué. Like, this is it. Because, he's described as being, by the people at the time, he was described as being a true Salvadoran because of all the industry he brought to the country. And my Mama Juana, like the work, she was in her 40s when her body was literally breaking down from the work. And I write about her in the cookbook. And if it hadn't been for a woman named Eva, Niña Eva, who offered her work in the kitchen of that finca where she was picking coffee, she would have died picking coffee because she couldn't get up. The exhaustion was so brutal. The work was just insane. And changing into cooking in the kitchen, it was work she could do, and then that becomes now a part of my family history. So, how have you felt in that moment? What do you do? Because I kind of know how I kind of take it. I walk away. I I cuss them out, I tell somebody else, oh my gosh, this man, and then yo ya me siento mejor. Like I I somehow I didn't repress the emotion, the anger, the la injusticia, right? But what have you learned to cope with that kind of feeling?
Yeah. I mean, you can't be in it all the time because otherwise, you'd have ulcers and never sleep. And a thing that has happened to me is whenever I see like a statue of somebody or, someone that we hold up as like this historical figure, I'm always like, where's the rest of the biography? Where's the part of the book that he didn't write? This is a thing that happened to me very recently when Jimmy Carter passed, where like people were like, el único presidente bueno, like such a good person. And I was like, yes, and right? Like you don't get to the presidency by being perfect, right? And like the presidency is a job that is full of hard decisions. And yes, he could have been, he probably is like one of the better presidents we've had, which is saying something. Certainly he was better than Ronald Reagan, but also like there are things that he did that still affect El Salvador today, and that set up the domino effect. Like, you know what I mean? Like this, I mean, a lot of this, people don't realize that like the School of the Americas, for example, is a thing that was started under JFK after
Mhm.
the Cuban Missile Crisis, and like in the middle of all of that. So like there's, you can celebrate somebody's legacy without saying that they were an angel or that they were a saint, you know? Like
Mhm.
all of these dudes have skeleton in their closets. There's no empire that was built without the sweat of our people's brow, you know what I mean? Um, and so it's hard to operate in the world constantly like turning over stones and being like, oh look, more dirt. That's what I thought, you know.
Um,
It's definitely hard. I also like, one of the things that I love about your book so much is that it is a beautiful reminder that women are the keepers of memory, that they are the keepers of legacy, that you know, this is a thing that you see in the Salvadoran Civil War also, that like they are the ones that keep family alive, and that really hold it down, and that our history, it can be told through a plate of food, you know, that it's not, you don't just have to pick up a history book to know, and that when you eat that food you can feel the history and the weight of the culture that comes with it, you know. So I watch telenovelas, is the truth. You know, I get a little fantasy novels from time to time and like let myself decompress
yes,
a
do
break.
it.
After you
Yes.
go home from the protest, take a bath, read a little fantasy, you know, watch a little Ruby rerun, you know, that's okay too. It's okay to take care of yourself. And to make a good meal for yourself, to feed you and your family, because that's also valuable work. That's the work that has kept us alive across generations.
I have this uh kind of plan in my head that the more I learn, the better my effort in being a goofball should be.
Yes, very good.
Because I learned through reading or just doing this cookbook. I was like, girl, if I don't play one of these days, me muero.
Yes.
Aquí me quedé. Like and also play, I think in our communities is not really encouraged. Like I remember having this moment of like, you know, wanting to try something and it's like, no, because I'm not going to be good at it. And, play is discovery and play is learning something and giving yourself a chance to have a safe space for something new. And I have not historically been good at that for myself. And so throughout this cookbook writing decade, I really was like, I need to learn how to play. I need to know how to try things. Let me show you. I tried knitting. No, what is this thing called? Crocheting. I
Crocheting,
suck at
yes.
it.
I do
I suck
embroidery.
at
I
it.
do needlepoint.
Oh, girl, maybe I'll try that because this is supposed to be a dinosaur that for my dog, he just found it. And I'm like, I should just give this to him
Just the
because
whole ball of yarn. You're
yeah,
like,
just
this is it.
I can't with it. This one's not for me, but play, and having these little things because we are more than what's happened to us. We are more than our histories. And we are goofballs. We should allow ourselves to be goofballs. Um, so yes, I'm with you on that because otherwise there it is a heavy load to know something se merece. The history requires us to know that. And I feel honored to know this information. Sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm just so grateful to come across this and to now be someone who can be entrusted to know this for the next generation. But it is a big ask, I feel.
Well,
I
and like
know, go
the thing,
ahead.
one of my favorite things to learn about that time period when in the middle of the Civil War, so people were still going out, people were still going to the disco to dance, you know, like there were of several, I tried to include some of them in the podcast, some of them we couldn't get the rights to, but if you go on YouTube, you'll find all kinds of songs that were written by revolutionaries, by people that were fighting in the war, about the things that were happening to them, like the songs were still being written, people were still singing, and without that joy, you can't survive. If you're not
Mhm.
enjoying life, then what are we fighting for? What is the struggle for? You know?
Yeah. Yeah. I know we've talked about your podcast, and I kind of want to shift gears. And you mentioned this just now, talking about the women and how they've been carriers of memory. How is this? I don't know. How long did it take you to do the podcast? A few years, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
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 So, how did all of that kind of inform your own womanhood, and what what do you feel has come to light because you've done this work as a Salvadoreña coming into it?
I feel very passionately about being a Latina, being Salvadoreña. Like, if I do have kids, I will be very insistent that they speak Spanish so that, like, when we go back to El Salvador, they're able to like communicate with their cousins and that they don't lose that part of them. I think it's really hard for a lot of kids that are like, you know, quote unquote no sabo kids, which is like such a shitty thing to do to
I
people.
know.
Like, it's nobody's fault that they don't speak Spanish, and like that doesn't make them any, you know, but that's like a whole
Yeah.
thing. We'll get into it online. I'm more so, I'm just grateful that my parents did that for me. And in fact, I very distinctly remember as a kid, like they realized that I was starting to lose my Spanish. And so they were studying for their citizenship tests at the time. And so they were like trying to learn English and were talking to me in English a lot. And at some point, they just stopped speaking to me in English because they knew that I was forgetting my Spanish. And I would throw tantrums. I would get so mad. I'd be like, I know you know what I'm saying. And they would completely ignore me. And now I'm just so grateful for that, you know?
Mhm.
But I think keeping these stories alive, generation to generation, that's the other thing that women do, right? I mean, and this is not a thing that is unique to Salvadorans or even to Latin
Mhm.
America, right? Like, women are the keepers of memory all over the world. When men go off to war, women are the ones that tell their stories.
Mhm.
And so being able to be that for my nieces and nephews, I mean, they were some of the people that I had in mind when I was making this show, of knowing that they grew up here and had no connection to their history and their stories. And it's one thing to sort of like hear, oh, Papa didn't have shoes until he was 15. And it's another thing to really understand the context of that and the full scope. And like, I got messages from my nieces and nephews that were like, wow, thank you for this show. And thank you for like helping us understand this. So I think storytelling in general is like, I don't think of my job as like a writer or a podcaster or whatever. I think of my job as storyteller, and I just
Mhm.
use different mediums to do that. And so being a part of that legacy of like the holders of memory, of the women in my family is a part of what this whole experience has done for me. And remind me that that is the a part of being a woman in a family, is like uh doing that, and knowing that like my mom is now a part of that story, I'm now a part of that story. So it's not just my grandma and what happened during these politically conflicted times, that like I also need to do that for my mom, and like make sure that I'm, because I interviewed my great grandma before she passed. My grandma thankfully is still with us. I have interviews with them, but it's always been this instinct of mine to like interview them and try and like preserve their stories. And so now getting to sort of be that for the next generation is really powerful.
Absolutely. I don't have any nieces or nephews, and I at first was thinking about how can, like, you don't often see women who aren't mothers being the people who are kind of the matriarchs, right?
Mhm.
And I feel like so much it was never that they were mothers, it's that they were storytellers, is that they were witnesses to things that were so great that they were like, no, people gotta know, you know. And so much of that has made me feel more free. And yeah, I think that there is the storytelling is a rite of passage in some ways. Like, once you're the one who is the keeper of the stories, you've now graduated to something, and now you take care of that, you know. It's kind of how it feels for me, or how I am digesting it.
Yeah, and like my tia Pasita, who you hear from in the first episode, she never had children of her own. She couldn't. Um,
Mm,
And she raised or helped raise multiple generations of people. My tia Vilma has, I think, 2 kids of her own, but has also raised multiple generations of children, has been that sort of like figure for people. And I think sometimes we underestimate the value of being a tia that is actively involved. You know, motherhood is an incredibly taxing thing. It's difficult to like financially, the labor of holding together a household. Like these are things that are hard to do. And so as someone who doesn't have kids of my own, I have the brain space and the capacity to like think about the role of being a woman in a family in a different way, and to give something different to these kids than maybe what your exhausted mom can do at this point. You know, like we put so much on moms in
Yes.
nuclear family. And so like, I'm very lucky that, you know, if my sisters can't go off and do all this research because they're busy, you know, taking care of 3 kids, that I get to do that. And I get to be the storyteller for my family, you know?
Absolutely. Um, so one of the things that I felt like when I learned about you, I felt mucha confianza. And it was the fact that you have this career that does a lot, and you're also a part of Sesame Street. That to me immediately said, I can trust her. There's something about like there's an emotional intelligence that feels present. Um, I think that when I've tried to learn about Monsignor Romero or the Civil War, I feel like I came across a lot of men or people who weren't Salvadoran. I felt like they were trying to kind of do a lot of trauma porn or just exploit something very tender and very raw. And I remember seeing the little image for the graphic for the podcast, and I saw your name, and I was like, I think I follow her on Twitter. I think she's and then I started listening, and then a friend, Victor, who had said, "Oh my gosh, this is great." And immediately I was like, I can learn from her. It'll be hard to hear what she has to say, but I won't feel like triggered or yeah, and so I want to give you that I want to just say that out loud for people to be like, no, there was something that really inspired confianza. And I have to assume that's because of your work with, you know, just how you carry yourself, but also like how balancing these kind of different work and creative worlds. How explain to me the how of that.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a really bizarre journey. I spent the first 10 years out of college because I went to school for musical theater. And I spent the first 10 years out of college, like kind of doing that and acting and performing in musicals, which my family was always very supportive of. But also it was like, girl, what are you doing? um, like, you know, it was hard to explain to like my family back home, like, what does she do? Like, what kind of job is that?
Yeah.
And at some point I got back into like writing and podcasting, and the journey to like becoming a journalist. I mean, even that, like a ton of imposter syndrome of being like, I'm a journalist, you know, but it is like you're going down and you're interviewing people and you're fact checking, and like that is what what the job of journalism is. And you know, the Sesame Street came to me. This is why I say that I'm like so proudly Latina. Like, oh, what's my dog doing? Hey, girl. All the good things that have happened to me in my life have really been connected to like me embracing my heritage and me embracing that side of me. I ended up on Sesame Street because they were looking for a new Latino cast member, and they did a nationwide search, and it came down to 2 of us. Um, I did like multiple rounds of interviews and auditions for months, and it came down to 2 of us. And if it was a girl, they were going to pick me. And if it was a guy, they were going to pick this guy. And they picked Ismael Cruz Cordova, who is now very famous. He's on the Lord of the Rings show. I'm happy for him. When I saw him coming out of the audition, I was like, damn you. Because I knew him already. And I was like,
Yeah.
he's very handsome.
Yeah.
And I knew that they were going to go with him. And they did. But then they called me a couple months later and they were like, actually, we have this other role for you. And it's been more than a decade now that I've worked at the show, and it's such an honor to be a part of that legacy. But like that really came from me just being unabashedly who I am. And a lot of the work that I've created since then was driven out of this like feeling that there isn't enough representation of us, and particularly representation that feels accurate.
Mhm.
When I was still doing musical theater, I mean, I know every Anita in the New York metro area. You know, there's West Side Story, and then like there's In the Heights now,
Mhm.
and then like a couple of other shows. But like there was so little work for Latinas that like we all knew each other. We would see each other constantly. And I remember distinctly thinking at some point, like, Lin-Manuel Miranda can't be the only person out there creating work for us. You know, he can't carry this by himself. And now, like, as a writer, I have things that are in development for TV. And uh, so much of my work is dedicated towards, you know, just creating more opportunities for Latinos to be able to tell their own stories, because there is a lot of work out there that like is written by men, is written by white people about us, and it's important for us to have control of our own narratives. You know, Oliver Stone did this movie, I think in the 90s, called Salvador, and
Mhm.
it's about like a journalist who goes down to El Salvador and whatever, and like it's very sensationalized, and the women are very much like side throwaway characters. And that's just not been my experience of this story. You know, you look at Marisa de Martinez, Roberto de Auison's sister, and
Mhm.
the way that she has had to carry the burden of that story. You look at the 4 church women that were murdered, and the community around them, these nuns that have kept their legacy alive. Like these are not stories that all of these stories do not just focus on men. And unless we as women, as Latinas, go out there and like take hold of these stories and tell them, like that cycle is just going to continue. People are just going to continue to write stories about us. And you know, going back to my imposter syndrome, who am I to tell this story? Well, if I don't tell it, who else is going to do it? You know,
Mhm.
like you have this story might have been told, but not by you, and not in the way that you're going to tell it. And,
Mhm.
you know, your perspective on things is just as valuable as anybody else's. And
Mhm.
so if I can do anything, it's like, I want to encourage people to like interview your family, look in your life, and see what your contribution to this story is, whether it's through a cookbook or through a podcast or through an article or whatever. You know, like we get to tell our own stories too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that when we finally have those opportunities, there's also this like the quality I feel of the detail of the storytelling is always so much more interesting because how a woman walks this earth is so different than how a man walks through this earth. A man's been taught entitlement. Um, Women, we know we need to rely on each other. So the characters in our stories are already so rich and they're already present because we can't survive alone, you know? And so I think it's exciting and very much like, you know, how you said, I see myself as a storyteller. And when we want to check these boxes because, you know, careers and professions require them, I always feel very like, bueno, what story are we telling that, because that will kind of dictate the medium, you know? Um, and yeah, I think that there's a lot of intuition there that is very, it's just integral to how women tell a story, I feel.
Well, and like
Um,
being part of this legacy of storytellers, right? Like, I love my dad to pieces, but like when my dad was coming to the US, like he 100% was thinking, oh, you know, pobrecita, you know, Anna, my mom, you know, I need to rescue her. I'm gonna be the one that like saves up money, and I'm gonna do it so that she can get out. My mom was like, fuck that. I'm gonna work myself to the bone and make sure that my family gets out of here. And I'm not gonna rely on some man to come and rescue me. And like,
mhm,
I think that's a part of why I feel so empowered to be able to tell these stories and to like take the narrative into my own hands, because those are the women that we come from.
Yeah.
Lucheras, they are not gonna, no se dejan por vencidas, they're not gonna, no se dejan in general. And so, that's the blood that all of us have is, we're survivors. Our people have survived a lot of horrific things, and they didn't survive all of that for us to be meek and to be quiet.
No. I have to tell you something. It relates to Sesame Street.
Okay.
So in 2017, I wrote a list of my goals for SalviSoul. And one of the things I wrote down was talk to Elmo.
Oh, stop. You know what? The next time I see Elmo, you're getting a video call.
Well, listen, and it came up again in this, I was doing this like thing for business and what do they call it? A cohort for women of color who had businesses. And everyone asked, like, what is the thing that you want in 5 years? And there were some folks like, well, we want to increase revenue by 50%, which is a lofty goal. And I said, I want to talk to Elmo because I think that what I'm looking for is not a metric of money. I'm not looking for a house, a big house. I'm looking for a shift in culture. That is the actual metric that tells me I'm doing my job. Because otherwise, things have stayed the same. We're getting the same information from the same places. And I think, I've gone back to that and I have this list right here. And it is kind of a crazy thing how so many things have changed. And we have these markers now that tell us the conversation is moving forward and there are more people at that table. And so it makes me just wonder, like, what other metrics are we going to need to kind of tell us, like, where are we going to now into the future? We have more, like, we are seeing those first in places and cookbooks and these enormously beautiful podcasts that you're creating, you as a cast member on Sesame Street. What do you think are the kind of goals and metrics that will tell us we're moving in the right direction in 10 years from now? Because as I look and I see a lot of like Salvadorans kind of being okay with fascism in El Salvador, in this country, I'm kind of like, I don't know if we just can hold on to what we have now, maybe that'll be a metric enough. But yeah, like tell me about that.
So one of the things that I think about a lot is that, and I mentioned this in the podcast, is that for a long time, the only stories told about El Salvador were about violence. And that was all anybody knew about us, right? It was like MS-13 and maybe pupusas was what Americans knew about us. And like, there really are not famous Salvadorans. Like now you're starting to get to some people that are breaking through. You look at like Julio Torres and his work. You look at Marcela Arguello, like these are people who very proudly wear their heritage, and that is a part of their work and a part of their legacy. Like Mexico, I could name you a billion famous Mexicans, but like famous Salvadorans, there are very few people that have actually broken through the public consciousness. So that to me is like, is number one, is like, we need to, and again, it's through our work, right? It's you just got to keep grinding, you keep doing the work, and something will break through. And I think that's important because you look at someone like Bad Bunny. Bad Bunny has become the voice of a generation and is bringing light to political problems in Puerto Rico that are not at the forefront of a government agenda. But he is creating a movement through his work, through his art, that is igniting new flames to very old discussions. And that, I think, to me is so important. I'm so proud of the work that he's doing. And when I listened to his new album, like listening to his song about Hawaii, like literally sobbing, thinking about the way that El Salvador is being viewed as like just an investment opportunity for rich people while the rest of the population is still living in poverty, you know, that they're buying up the beach, that they're opening mines and going to destroy the environment for what? So for you know, like cuando va beneficiar el pueblo, like
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
to me is important. And so like that's why I continue to do work to try to create a platform that makes me big enough so that people will listen to what I say and take notice, and maybe I can start changing hearts and minds so that I can start making people take notice and sit up and think about things from a different perspective. Because you look at these governments and they're very good at using social media to tell a very specific version of a story.
Yes.
And the story that is convenient to them and to oligarchs that still exist, whether they're tech broligarchs or Bitcoin broligarchs, like these oligarchies, they are working to their own benefit. And so we need to be out there and counteracting those narratives. And the only way we get there is through doing the work, you know, and building these platforms. And so to me, that's a big step. And also it's like, it's the sisterhood of like, that's why Marcela inspired me to look into Oscar Romero. I do my work. I interview her on the podcast. That connects me and you become friends. You know, now I'm doing this interview with you. Like just amplifying each other's voices and amplifying our platforms is also so important. You know, there's always been this like, this idea that like, there's only room for one at the top, and that's just not true, you know?
Bullshit. Yeah. It's bullshit. It's a scarcity mindset, as they say. And personally, like, if the fact that the book is here and done, I always say it is because of Salvadoran women. I did not go, I don't have the backing of like some institution, like, well, my publisher is one. But when I finally got that support, the institution was mujeres from El Salvador who backed me up and said, "We fuck with you. Let's go." You know, they believed in it first. I didn't have a name, I didn't have an account or anything, but they're like, "No, I get it." And I've shared this story many times about when I pitched it to my grandmother. She didn't just set the tone for me with that project with SalviSoul, but just for my whole life. I pitched her, Malusi, ¿qué tal si hago unas entrevistas, cocinamos juntas? What do you think? You know, and what if I did it again and interviewed more women? And she's like, Carla, te entiendo. Esto se trata del legado de la mujer salvadoreña. And I was like, okay, we're done. I don't need to find a North Star, a guiding star. The eldest of my elders just told me what I got to do in this life. Done, you know? And when I find people like you, like Marcela, and so many others that are in my orbit here in LA, and thankfully through social media, like it takes there's a certain je ne sais quoi that you feel, and you're like, okay, las mujeres are taking care of each other. And it's exciting. It's exciting. It's still a very arduous journey, but it's one that I think has been so worth it.
Well, and like, you know, I can only imagine how much work went into making your book. And like, nobody's out here handing out book deals for free. You know what I mean? Like that, I like, I'm sure if you're like a writer for the New York Times, like maybe somebody's handing you something for free. If you went to Princeton and you know somebody who's already working there and their dad works in publishing, like maybe you're getting something for free. But like for us, I don't know nobody, you know,
No.
if everything I have clawed my way. I have jammed my foot in the door to get it. And, you know, the conversation about like for student loan forgiveness, I worked for fucking years to pay off my student loans because my parents couldn't afford to send me to school. I took out student loans.
Yeah.
And now like student loan forgiveness, people are like, oh, how can you, I worked hard to pay off mine and you're not gonna get yours for free. Yeah, give them for free, man. Like if I can give a hand to my nieces and nephews, if I can get them in the door, if I can, you know, like to to other people in the Salvadoran community, because you know what? I had to claw to get every ounce of work that I've gotten. And like, we have to make things easier for each other. We have to
Mhm.
open doors for one another. Like
Mhm.
one of my favorite stories, there's this beautiful book, Pachinko, that's about
Yeah.
a Korean family.
Yes.
And the
It was
reason why that
good.
got made was because there was an Asian executive at Apple that pioneered for it and like and championed it and was like, we have to make this. And that
Mhm.
story is so beautiful and so universal, like Crazy Rich Asians. Like there are these stories that resonate. And what there is a lack of Latino executives in Hollywood that are going to go and champion this. There's starting to be more. But like, we have to support our community. We have to create opportunities for each other because nobody is out here giving that shit for free.
Yeah. And it's also like I also tell folks like even if you're not Latino, like you've got a role to play. Because some of the people like I always share this when I was looking for agents, I always pitched Latina agents or just anyone that had experience talking with someone who is usually in the marginalized section, or the niche section. And those were the people I often got more no's from.
Hmm.
And then it took me a minute to really understand that they just had their roster of a lot of niche authors that they didn't have enough fight for me you
Mhm.
know? And I'm like, of course, because if they're a person of color in their agency, their whole position is a fight, and now they're representing a whole other, like they literally cannot do it on by themselves. And so I always tell everybody, I'm like, listen, I'm doing my part. I'm showing up and I'm insisting on it. So you got to do your part. Everybody has a role. Tú ponte ahí en tu palo tuyo y yo me pongo palo mío, and then we're gonna meet in the center. Because otherwise it's too chaotic, and we can't shift the needle this way. It isn't, and as we've seen, it be your own sometimes that have these who insist on going back or who insist on, you know, justifying the actions of really bad people. So, anywho, I feel like there's so many things that we could talk about, but I also want to make sure that I don't hold you here forever. So I'll just end with one last question. And you have a lot of creative projects. What, how do you balance it? And how, if you were thinking of like ideal careers, where do we see you 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now?
Well, I say this all the time, and if she's listening, please call me. But I want to be the Latina Shonda Rhimes. I want to
Mhm.
create an empire of stories that center Latina women and tell our stories in the like broadness uh broadness that we hold. We all contain multitudes, and I think what Shonda Rhimes has been able to do for Black women, I would love to do for Latinas.
Mm.
And how do I balance stuff? Oh, I don't. Stuff, I'd be spinning so many plates and some of them fall off, you know what I mean? And then you just got to go back and pick it up and try and put it together and see if you can get it spinning again. I have a lot. The world is so full of no's and so full of closed doors that the only way to find success is to just constantly be creating more work and have it and
Yeah.
putting multiple eggs in different baskets, and to be I have like 6 or 7 projects going at the same time at any given moment, and I'm just kind of like, I like going like God, and we'll see which one succeeds and we'll see which one gets out there. So that's the way that I've learned to operate as like a freelancer, is and also like, this is the thing that one of my college professors said to me at some point, but he was like, you take a job for one of 3 reasons, and ideally it hits 2 of these, but almost never will you get all 3. And it's like, you take it for money, you take it for passion, or you take it because it gets you in the door and creates opportunities for later. And it's because it's
Mhm.
people that you want to work with. And so, sometimes I'm doing projects to keep the lights on, and sometimes I'm doing projects like my podcast where, you know, it's not like I was buying my McMansion with the money that I got from it. You know, I'm sure the same for you. Like, it's not like that book made you a millionaire, but it was work that was worth doing, that I felt passionate about, and that has rewarded me in ways that are both monetary and not monetary, you know, and that's creating more work because I put my whole heart into it and people can sense that, you know. But yeah, that like my whole being is just focused around creating more opportunities for us, you know.
I love that. And I believe it too. I thought I was gonna be full like out of juice by the time the cookbook came out. But I found out that, I think inspiration begets inspiration and work does the same. And yeah. And I think sometimes the consejo is like focus on one thing, and I've learned that the opposite is very much more healthy. It's like, no, have fun, give yourself the opportunity to explore many things, and then, like you said, see what happens. Bueno, I love this. This was so wonderful. Thank you, Jasmine, for being so generous with your insight and your stories. This was just so incredible. Yeah, I'm excited, and I think this is where our interview Q&A ends.
Thank you. Thank you for reaching out to me. Thank you for everything you do. Thank you for bringing this community together. You are such an inspiration to me and such a shining light. And like, you know, when we were kids, you used to watch on Univision and it would be like, or on Telemundo, and it was like, y es por eso que es un orgullo hispano. Like, that's you. That's you 100%. So thank you for doing this.
Oh my gosh. Well, likewise, kudos. I remember those were, yeah.
You remember
Noticiero was camp. That's just, you're not going to tell me it wasn't, that's what they were going for. Because some of those, I'm like, y'all did not need to be that extra. En qué cabeza cabe, but okay, we get it.
Yes. And also, Deal or No Deal, that was from Sábado Gigante. Y'all stole that. You can't
Oh,
tell me they
yeah,
didn't.
you're right. Sábado Gigante, wow. Ese chileno man made some impact. Ah, okay,
Legacy.
Jasmine. Well, thank you so much. We can also hang up here.
Yes.
Si quieres me mandas, or how am I gonna